Hello, welcome to Varn Blog. And today we're here with One Dime, who runs a YouTube channel and a podcast associated that on a Patreon. And he has been a popularizer of Marxist and MMT overlap in Canada and in general, theoretically. So I wanted to start off with the question about why do you think modern monetary theory is useful for Marxists? Because this debate, and it's a debate that I'm actually kind of agnostic on, seems to be something that both sides can get a little bit fiery about. I recently had Max Seho of Superstructure podcast on, and he was very subtly critical of Marxism's Hegelian ancestry and seemed to want to distance M&T's project from it a little bit. I also know there are Marxists such as Douglas Lane and most Trotskyists, for example, who are highly critical of neo-chartalism. So,
and there's Doug Henwood.
Yeah, Doug Henwood, who, well, I mean, Doug, we're recording this in early February of 2022 for the future, so people would know. Doug Henwood's had a Who Says This, Doug Henwood or Paul Volcker or Larry Summers thing going on lately, so who knows with him. I mean, he was advocating raising interest rates into the double digits, which no one even in the Fed is advocating. Yeah. So, what do you think these two theories have to offer each other?
So first off, I'll just give a little brief introduction. So I run the channel called One Dime, as well as the podcast associated with it called One Dime Radio. On there, I do videos basically trying to tackle a lot of issues. Started off with mainly critical theory, then kind of went a lot more into political economy, and also just because there's a lot of stuff I've been reading for a long time, and I thought, why not put these into video essays to kind of help explore the concepts. So yeah, as you referred, most recently I've done two videos kind of involving modern monetary theory, one called The Deficit Myth, The Biggest Lie in Politics, and the most recent one called The Problem with Taxing the Rich, in which that one doesn't use modern monetary theory to kind of debunk the sort of narrative that we need to tax the rich just to pay for social programs. Obviously, I'm not against taxing the rich, if it was offered on the table, but this should not be what we rely on to pay for programs. But in that video, I also kind of suggest and imply that modern monetary theory is not sufficient really for when it comes to solutions to things like inequality. For example, in the second half of the video, I say that the root cause of inequality is private property, something that is pretty obvious to most Marxists. But it's a thing that, frankly, I don't really see a lot of the MMTers advocates really talk about. And I'm more just in general, these aren't things I don't see the left as a whole in the United States and Canada talk about. That we should really be dealing with the question of private property and the fact that you have people buying tons of properties, raising the costs, and making homes unaffordable, as well as the general question of landlords. Rentism. Should we, maybe think about overcoming that? Because So these are the type of questions I want to introduce, which I don't think MMT is sufficient for. So I guess that kind of is the first part of the answer to your question: is what do Marxism and MMT offer each other? I think on the one hand, Marxism is useful to MMT mainly because MMT I hardly even consider political theory. It's really strictly like an economic theory that is useful for what it suggests, and that is analyzing monetary operations, macroeconomic policy. And that's really what it's designed to do. The thing is some of the MMT advocates who only base their politics on MMT and not other theories I think, can be a bit blindsided by the power struggles it will actually take, the class struggles, to actually achieve the policies that many MMT advocates call for, such as a federal jobs guarantee, um, universal health care if you're in the United States, uh, all sort of policies. Some even advocate for nationalization. Some advocate for price controls, different taxes, some universal basic income, although many MMT advocates are pretty critical of basic income. But what I think we can learn, what MMT can learn, or rather MMTers, advocates, can learn from Marxism, is how do we get this? And I think there's a big historical lesson that I would say more broadly, the contemporary left, who's predominantly social democratic, at least when it comes to like the DSA, the biggest factions of the DSA, or people like that, and or the Bernie Sanders left, is there isn't really an effort to learn from how these policies have historically been implemented in history. We only find that, and this is probably obvious to you, Derek, but or some Marxists who know about like working class history, is social democratic policies like full employment and the nationalization of industries and social welfare programs really only get implemented on a mass scale in response to more radical labor movements, whether it just be militant labor movements, anarchist movements, Marxist movements, as we saw in Finland, sort of before World War II and after World War II, and rest of Scandinavia, and Scandinavian countries like Denmark, Sweden, in Norway, as well as most notably United States, right? With Roosevelt, that didn't come out of a vacuum. That came out of a long history of militant labor struggle. So the answer is right there. Is class struggle is something we need to really take and learn from, as well as the state. I think the problem that the MMTers have, I know I'm throwing a bunch of things here, but it's a big question. So there's a lot of things that both sides can learn from each other. But I would say that a lot of the MMTers, like most notably Warren Mosler, Stephanie Kelton, Randall Wray, Bill Mitchell, even, who kind of identifies himself as a Marxist MMTer, they all fall into this trap, maybe intentionally or not, that by assuming that the state is sort of neutral, and obviously this is a big old debate that goes back between Marx and the Social Democratic Party of Germany, and this idea that the state is a neutral thing that can be taken over, and we can use the state's policies of issuing capabilities of issuing currency to direct this to the public purpose. You hear that being talked about a lot, the public purpose. But there isn't really enough thought about how the state, at least capitalist states, are actually constructed and their inherent class bias and class character. Like the way constitutions, for example, of like Canada and the United States are structured is deliberately to ensure private property rights. The electoral systems are formed deliberately to prevent majoritarian rule. There's all these things in place that make it not so easy to implement these policies that they often call for. So I think there needs to be a discussion about that. That's where Marxism is certainly helpful. Various Marxist theorists, certainly the ones I'm very informed by, are Louis Althusser, people like that, Gramsci, who I think can be very useful for understanding these things, and of course Marx himself. In the inverse, how do Marxists benefit from MMT? Well, I mean, Marx could only know what he knew in his time, and at the time he believed in the barter story of money. That of course money arose spontaneously out of market exchange, first through barter, then market exchange. Kind of like a very metalist view of money. His view of money is very stuck in the time where people were attached currency to either gold or silver or some sort of bullion. And
with one caveat that he does talk about non-commodity money in volume 2 a little bit, but it's credit money, not state money. And then he mentions the possibility of state money in the Grundrisse, but doesn't do anything with it. So you're absolutely right. Like, it is, I mean, I think Bill Mitchell's big thing to point out that yes, there are passages in Marx where he starts to like get that there's something going on there, but it's so far out of left field from classical political economy that it's not really gone. It's not, he doesn't venture down there hardly at all.
Yeah, as well. And with Marx, because his he could only, the anthropology wasn't there to really debunk the barter story that Marx assumed from Adam Smith. Um, because of that, he was limited to what was available, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the problem is, of course, as Marxists, if we want to treat Marxism as a science, it has to evolve and has to analyze changes in material conditions. And I think that's where MMT is useful, as it understands modern money, as well as it kind of with it the nuances surrounding the story of money and its origins, but more importantly, modern money following the removal of the gold standard in the 1970s. So 1970s. And with that, you have a lot of Marxists today who will put forth really good ideas, but then completely fall flat when it comes to monetary operations. You'll often hear Marxists have policies, and then they'll talk about, raising things through tax revenue. I remember reading Paul Cockshot's book, Towards a New Socialism, which a lot of it I thought was really good and I agreed with. It was really innovative and interesting. Then there's a part about budgeting and financing various things, and he talks about tax revenue funding things. And there's really not a lot of thought that if the government is the issuer of the currency, they don't depend on collecting that currency from people to fund their operations. There isn't that basic thought, and I think it's because MMT questions the most obvious answers, and that is, what is money? Where does it come from? And I think we need to be asking those kind of questions, and it's useful. As we alluded to before, some people like Doug Henwood, Marxists like that, still believe that inflation can be fought by raising interest rates, which is not only does that not work, it's also, it just literally doesn't work. To assume that raising interest rates solves inflation assumes that all inflation is caused by excess printing of money, which is, a neoliberal monetarist, neoclassical assumption, popularized by the neoliberal monetarists. And this has devastating consequences for the working class. Of course, raising interest rates causes huge unemployment. So it's really troubling. Imagine if we do elect socialists into government, and they're informed by very backward ideas of money, and they think that they need to impose austerity in order to balance budgets or tax the working class to fund things. So it's really important because this informs how, I'll say more broadly, leftists as a whole would act if they get power in anywhere, really.
Well, to grant you the historical example that I think most people should look at was the SPD and Weimar Germany actually overseeing an anti-inflation austerity program, which actually turned a lot of the recently unemployed working class against it, moving them to the KPD, which was the Communist Party, or to neutrality in regards to the fascist. So, I mean, we do have historical evidence that Marxists not understanding that they shouldn't do austerity to fund government programs is not a great idea. Furthermore, there's other theories involved in that too, about monopoly capital and seizure of monopoly capital, and developing industry to then seize on and socialize later that informed this. So it wasn't just a monetary mistake, but it was definitely part of what they were doing. So I don't want to oversimplify the picture, but we have an example of Marxists making a wrong turn here. We also have Trotsky even, for example, and Mandel, Ernst Mandel, the European Trotskyists were gold standard people, which I find, whatever my feelings about MMT, I find bizarre, given that even in Marx, that's not a given. It is in Capital. It is in Capital Volume 1, but it's not elsewhere. And I can't, for the life of me, figure out why on earth you'd want stronger money unless you had a quasi-accelerationist theory of crisis or something. But so yeah, there are definitely places where this shows up. I guess this really shows up in the case of someone like, we've mentioned him directly, but Doug Henwood's done several attacks on modern monetary theory, including not just agreeing with Larry Summers in the controversy in early February of this year, but even exceeding him in what he thought the answer would be, which was to raise interest rates into the double-digit range which is truly a Volcker shock.
He called himself a good finance Marxist
Yeah.
or
Oh my
something like
God.
that.
Yeah,
It's
and
it's basically austerity hawkishness.
yeah, I mean it's and one that actually goes further than the Federal Reserve banks do right now, which is and given that they are also hawkish, that should worry us. I would the one thing I would say is that, and maybe this will get you to the next question here, is that MMT right now has suffered from the fact that it has not let its theories, and there are at least two, um, of inflation be well understood. Like it hasn't pushed that as part of its popularization agenda. Um, but the thing is, when we look at the Volcker shock, we know from history it took 6 years for inflation to start to go down in any significant amount from the time period of the Fed, bumping up interest rates. It's hard to attribute. I mean, I guess one could uh the Volcker shock for the decrease in inflation.
They
Furthermore,
do.
yeah,
That's
I
part
know,
of the revisionist economic history.
right? But what's funny is how it's supposed to work. So it assumes that the average worker is not is uh is not saving but investing their excess money. Um and so to curtail
Or
inflation,
like spending it on
right,
like
right, right,
products.
spending
Yeah.
it right on products, right? But but the idea that 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 assumes that the average worker is spending it on products that are not necessary, like necessities that are not factored into the general inflation rate anyway. And it assumes that they have the capacity to save when they're not spending, and also it assumes that banks will pass the rate increases through interbank loaning on to consumers in savings accounts. Now, I haven't looked at that data in a long time, but just logically, I don't see a lot of evidence that that the average worker could stop spending because of what they're spending stuff on, um, and flip to a savings mode. And there's no guarantee that the interest rates in savings accounts would raise significantly for an increase in interest rate of bank through bank lending.
If
Um,
anything, it makes it a little bit worse. I mean, there's people like Warren Mosler and Phil Armstrong have papers about that. Is because when they raise interest rates, what does this do? It shuts a lot of businesses down. This declines productive capacity, decreases competition, raises
mm,
prices. And also, when you raise interest rates, it's just giving rich people free money because they have higher interest on their bond yields. So they're getting all this free money. They might actually spend that extra money on stupid stuff. I don't know. To give a fictional example, like American Psycho's depiction of like yuppie culture,
mm,
the 80s was filled with like stupid consumerism, both the 80s and the 90s. Um, although that part, I think the proof is a little bit mixed as to whether like having the high bond yields makes rich people spend more money, because there's also evidence that rich people just hoard their money when they get more of it. Um, but either way, the idea that interest rates would stop inflation has been debunked not only by MMT. There's also just in general a lot of Keynesian theorists who've come to realize this, because there's sort of undeniable proof now. With, for example, first with Japan, because Japan is really the first country to do quantitative easing on a massive scale and inflate the money supply, and were trying to create inflation because they had obviously a population crisis, declining productive capacity, lowering or most are population crisis, declining demand, and declining prices. And in response to that, they try to flood the system with money in a privatized way through quantitative easing, with private banks creating tons of money, 0% interest rates. Uh, couldn't they were still in deflation. It didn't even work to create their goal of like a modest sum of inflation in Japan. So there's that. And now since then Japan has a debt to GDP of over 200%, 250 I think percent, and still in deflation. I mean, it's clearly not a relevant, it's not clearly not true, the quantitative theory of money. But then there's also the EU also flooded their system with money in response to 2008 crisis and even more COVID. But in the not much inflation really. United States too. Remember in 2008, well, not 2000, not it was really like 2012, 2010s when Obama was issuing those like huge policies to rescue the economy after the 2008 crash. And remember when people like Rand Paul were saying, or Ron Paul, one of them Pauls, were trying to say that the U.S. is going to run out of money and that the U.S. is going to have hyperinflation. It's going to become like Greece. That never happened. So it's been debunked. Actually, the quantitative theory of money, which is the idea that the increase in money supply plus an increase in the velocity of money, how much that money is being spent, will equal higher rates of inflation. It's actually been discarded in many economics departments already, just because it's just simply not true. There's a good YouTube channel out there called Money and Macro. He's an economist. He's not really an outwardly. I never heard him talk about MMT, but I mean, he comes to very similar conclusions regarding inflation. That it's not just increases in money; it's a lot to do with productive capacity. It has to do with the ability to set prices and all sort of complexities. And maybe to answer your initial question, part of why I think MMT people, as well as maybe heterodox economists in general, have trouble articulating the nuances of inflation is because it is just simply complex. And there's many factors. There's supply chains. There's the prices the government pays. There's the monopolies who price gouge. There's productive capacity. There's all sort of factors. And there's also inflation expectations, which can create inflation. That's another huge weird thing. So it's complicated. It's hard to articulate compared to like the simple narrative of, oh, it's just printing money, because we have the idea in our heads. If there's more money out there, it'll be worth less and it'll devalue. That's how we think of it in our heads, when it's not really what it works like that. I think in the popular imagination, the idea of inflation isn't that inflation is higher prices. It's that inflation is declining value of currency, and then the prices are a response to that, when it's actually the other way around. The value of the currency devalues in response to the higher prices, because of so I think it's
we have currency lose value actually all the time and not see inflation more than 3%. I mean, if you're just looking through, like, if you know the history of the last 20 years and in currency exchanges between the U.S. and other currencies, the U.S. has
Canada especially.
And with Canada, the U.S.'s relative value has gone up and down a lot. When I lived abroad, it was like a major issue in my life, but it didn't change the organic internal inflation to the United States, which is about 2 to 3%. I mean, and sometimes actually it seemed to be completely unrelated, totally. Like there was no relationship whatsoever. So I think that's it, and I say this not just from studying economics, I say this from my life experience. Like I lived abroad and I would notice like, oh, prices aren't changing very much in the US, but the dollar's changing all over the place. So there's that complication. I also think, I mean, there are debates about what the exact inflation mechanism is. Is it like its exact relationship to production and MMT? And by this, this is not a debate over which mechanisms will work, but which ones are the predominant ones in play. What I would say is that it is very complicated. And when you start looking at phenomenon like in economics, we might talk about uh, cost push and demand pull inflation. But one of the weirder things that I've looked at recently is cost push inflation, which the cost of production goes up for supply chain reasons or whatever. Um, but then it turns into calling it demand pull is actually incorrect because it's not demand. It's just the prices don't go down even after supply chain normalizes. Um, and stuff like that. This is not an easy thing to just telegraph about. And unfortunately, I think this is one of this has been a downside of MMT's popularization because the initial explanation actually is easy to understand. Once you grasp that currency is not something that like
Yeah, it's not like
exists,
gold coins.
right?
Yeah.
And even the gold standard. I mean, like, people don't understand this. Like, even with gold coins and whatnot,
Yeah, the gold was just there to give an illusion of value when it's
right?
still like a construct, because MMT was still applicable to the gold standard. Just that, but the reason why it's not as applicable is because with the gold standard, you can't create as much money as you want because there's a big constraint because you have to fill that up with an equivalent amount of gold. But even then, like the idea that taxes don't drive government spending was also true in the gold standard era, because you have Beardsley Ruml, who is the chairman of the Federal Reserve in the 1940s when America was implementing the New Deal. And or not, well, it's long implemented obviously before, but in like the height of the New Deal or whatever, he has a paper called "Taxes for Revenue Are Obsolete," where he comes out and says it, that the taxes are there to drive the value of the money, there to control inflation and incentives, and or allocation of resources. It's not there to fund federal spending.
I think this is also something that we have to get, even for Marxists to get through their thick skulls sometimes, is that wealth and nominal income are only kind of related. I mean, I know that's a very simple that's a very simple thing,
Yeah,
but
well, money is a means to get wealth, not the wealth itself, right?
bingo. So like
Yeah.
even when we have like profit rate debates, which are huge debates, MMT actually doesn't settle that, because what the profit rates aren't about the nominal rate of profit and currency. They're about the amount of wealth that production would produce. And by wealth, I mean tangible wealth. Then we have abstract value and all those other things that come out of that. And these are tied into various theories in Marxism, various theories of money. I'm thinking of the work now of Michael Heinrich, who's trying to use, I think, stuff from the Grundrisse to argue that Marx was beginning to develop a monetary theory of value. I must say, I'm not whether that theory is true or not in reality to economics is separate from whether I think Marx had it. I don't see it in Capital. Um, but that's neither here nor there as far as our
There's a book out
disagreement.
there that I
Mm-hmm.
actually got. I never read it yet, but it's called Marx's Monetary Theory, or Marx. Yeah, it's something like that.
Marxist monetary theory, yeah.
Yeah, I have that one. I haven't looked at it yet.
That particular author has a beef with MMT, but it's a very weird technical beef. So,
Is it about
um,
labor theory of value?
sort of.
I
Yeah.
can imagine. Yeah,
But I mean,
that's
like,
that's the debate I always find I don't really have a stake in,
mm,
because on one hand, I don't I'm not super. I'm not one of those like labor theory or value orthodox types who's like
mm,
really down to defend it. For me, for the labor theory of value is for the most part true in the sense that its goal and its purpose is to prove exploitation, and I think for the most part that's true for the majority of firms. So it's like I find it useful, but it's not the kind of debate I find super interesting about. Uh,
yeah.
because people try to bring it to machines, and there's that debate,
Yeah, I was
and I
about to
find
say
that
that's
one
the Steve
yeah,
King versus Marxist debate, and the neo-Keynesian
yeah,
versus
yeah.
Marxist debate over whether or not machines have value. And I remember I actually talked to Steve King about this about a decade ago. It was building up to the Greek crisis, and I was just like, well, like honestly, it really depends on how you interpret social necessary decreases versus adding value. And frankly, that debate is semantic. Like, And people are like, what? I'm like, it's a semantic debate because if even if you believe that fixed capital can't add value, and I'll explain what it means, uh, technology decreasing socially necessary labor time would mean it would look just like the prediction is identical to whether or not it adds value or whether or not it just reduces social necessary labor time. It would mean that you could do more work with fewer workers as long as you had workers involved, and that would increase rates of exploitation through variable capital. It doesn't
Mm-hmm.
matter if the machines are adding value or not. And the other thing is, like, and you and I talked about this a little bit, or we hinted at it in our semi debate over at This is Revolution, where I agree with you that most Marxists don't agree on what labor theory of value actually describes, whether or not it describes the statistical aggregate of an attractor to price itself, which that one, by the way, is just objectively wrong. Like, if someone tries to convince you that LVT explains individual commodity prices,
Well, I always thought nobody actually argued that except people who on the internet, because that's
yeah,
just obvious if you look at anything like Supreme
no serious
or.
Marxist argues it. Some physiocrats do, actually,
Hmm.
but they're like, I don't know any. I don't think there's been physiocrats since the early 20th century. Like, so, but when you do hear people misunderstand it that way, I think someone argued that Anwar Shaikh actually accidentally makes this argument somewhere, but I haven't found it. Um, so, so just people know that one, if people argue it, they're wrong. And then there's value form theory, which means that value changes forms in a way that's not measurable. So it has no numeric, like, you can't meaningfully talk about it as a numeric
Is
thing. It's
that
like,
like the Graeber critique?
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. And it also goes back to, like, Isaac Rubens and whatnot, but it's the idea that it's something so abstract that it's not nominal, or you can express it numerically, really. Um, in which case we can't really talk about it in terms of, like, normal economics, right? Like, it's just not useful. Um, but this actually does bring us to some of the implications of our theory going forward. Um, there are a lot of MMTers who will talk about, crashes and whatnot as simple policy choices, but without any conception of class issues in those policy choices, or why, like, they make it sound like, oh, it's just an ideological,
It's politicians being stupid.
yeah, being
Yeah.
stupid. And I'm like, I don't believe that. That's I actually think if you look at power relationships between
Mhm.
classes, a lot of that stuff makes a lot of sense that they're doing. For
Oh yeah,
example,
of
right
course.
now, raising the interest rate will, if it
Give rich
doesn't,
people free money.
right, if it doesn't freeze, it will give, it does change some rich people they're giving free money to, because they were giving rich people free money another way through quantitative easing. But if it doesn't freeze, if it doesn't lead to massive unemployment, it's at least going to lead to, because we have, quote, underemployment right, I mean, overemployment right now anyway, or whatever, which is weird. It's a weird concept, but we have the quote unquote labor shortage. It will at least depress wages, maybe not just real wages, which is always kind of being depressed, but maybe even nominal wages, which means that you see wage freezes and things going down significantly in comparison to inflation. Um, that 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 indicates to me that the issue here is not just inflation; it's also worker leverage, that's being hit here, and it's kind
Capital
of
as power.
right. Um, and I think people need to look at that when they look at this. Yes, I mean, yes, we will admit. I think almost everybody will admit inflation above 7% is bad for, workers.
Yeah, of course.
No one's going to not say that. But the other thing is, and this I know from Fed documents, they're not expecting inflation to end when they raise rates, at least not immediately. They're not predicting that. Like, they're predicting inflation for another 2 years. So,
Well, I mean, This goes back actually to your question: is how to can MMT articulate the inflation story? And I
Mhm.
think there's one way to do it. It's hard because it's obviously there's so much nuances, but I think everyone sees the supply chain shortages. It's obvious to anyone who goes to a supermarket and you see less things than you used to. Some things are out of stock. It should be obvious to put those two things together. Like that is why there's inflation, or at least that's a big part of why. It's not the singular factor, of course, because there's also the price gouging. Um, but that's a huge factor. Is when you have a shortage of goods, the price goes up. And there's a lot of conservatives, or the not just conservatives, but like the people who buy into neoclassical economics, they fail to make this clear, obvious observation that these things are connected. They say shortages must be because we're becoming like a Soviet Union. You hear people saying that a lot, and you have inflation. They'll say it's because we're printing money. It's like, can you not tell that these things are connected? Because when the first round of quantitative easing under Trump, which created like the biggest influx of money we've seen in a long time, there wasn't inflation. There wasn't inflation until we started seeing ports close down. And then you started seeing the economy open up. You have all this consumer demand all of a sudden, but like the supply chains just aren't working well. So you have all this new demand, but you got low supply. You get higher prices, and you also got all these firms now who want to compensate for having depreciated rates of profit during COVID, who want to make up for those rates of profit by raising prices. So yeah, you have that. And I mean, there's the meme going around, which I think kind of explains part of the story, where it says inflation is at this highest rate since 30 years. And it says corporate profits are the highest rate they've been since blah, blah, blah. Yeah, you can see how it's connected. So I think
Yeah,
there's ways to put it together. It's just not easy.
I think that's a fair point. Let's talk about this is what worries me about this upcoming interest rate raise. I've had people who think in terms of Democratic and Republican politics, and I've been kind of laughing at them because they're not going to ruin the economy under a Democratic president, and I'm like, why do you think
They
that?
forgot Clinton existed.
Right? I was like,
Clinton
why do
tried to balance the budget.
you?
Like people forget that they really tried to balance the budget.
Well, the other thing is, I'm like, it's not just the U.S. Fed threatening this. The interest rate raises, which while they aren't anything like a Volcker raise, I will say that. Although they may actually be worse in effect because they're not just in one country. And the other thing that's going to be, and this is a policy I am more skeptical of, but the other thing they're going to be doing is in the next couple of months, they're going to stop doing bond buybacks, so which I will formally in quantitative easing. So you will have both an interest rate raise and um, the end of QE as we know it. But it's not just the Fed saying they're going to do this. The Bank of Canada said they're going to follow suit. The Bank of Japan, which I'm
Bank
actually
of Bank
surprised
of
about.
England too.
Yeah, Bank of England.
Yeah.
I don't. I think the EU has more legal prohibitions on what they can do, but they were saying they were going to follow suit as well, and so it looks like we're going to have most of the currency sovereign nations, as far embark on um, fiscal austerity or monetary austerity. I mean, I don't really
Yeah.
see how we get around that.
Well, I mean, it's an easy answer to kind of refute the idea that we're in an MMT world. I hear that being said a lot, especially by like the libertarian types. They say they'll actually quite often blame inflation out on modern monetary theory because their idea of modern monetary theory is just plainly accepting that deficits don't matter and that you can just print as much money as you want. But I mean, like, you have Republicans come out and say deficits don't matter. Like Dick Cheney said, Reagan proved deficits don't matter. That's not a MMT position per se, like exclusive to MMT position. But there's this idea that MMT is being like tried and failed when that's clearly not true. Obviously, which should be obvious just by the fact that they're considering raising interest rates. But no, we're still very much in a neoliberal world, monetarist world. I know there's this attempt to say like there's this new Keynesianism, and there's all these like opportunists like Paul Krugman who Some people lump in with MMT bizarrely, even though he's more like a new neo-Keynesian who used to be a neoliberal, who's kind of now just riding the tide of whatever the dominant
I think
positions.
that has to do with his mint the coin talk like a few years ago. But he's never, other than that talk being confused with MMT, he's never been an MMT advocate. Like he's
He
opposed
used
some.
to use pay fors. He used to say that, oh, we're gonna like pay for it via this, and this. He
Mm,
used to be like that type of Keynesian. I mean, he never. That's the thing about Krugman, right? He actually wasn't. In the '90s, he was a neoliberal.
mm,
So, but anyway, aside from like clowns like that, but when it comes to the interest rates, I mean, this proves we're still in the neoliberal world. Which now I have a bit of theory with why they're going to do interest rate raises, uh, and I have no way of knowing this is true because it hasn't happened yet. But my theory right now is that they're not actually going to raise interest rates as much as they say they're going to do that. And this applies to
mm,
all the countries you mentioned. This is really to like change inflation expectations. I think they're doing this so that people will think in their head, oh, inflation will get better, and then they'll kind of adjust prices accordingly, the production of goods accordingly, and also a big part of it's investment, because I
mm.
think like inflation expectations definitely cause a lot of fear in the stock market. People will not want to invest. If there's a less inflation expectations, people will invest in the stock market, because stock market futures and these investments, they're not based on what the economy is now. They're based on what they think it'll be in the future, right? So I think that's part of it. I don't think they'll actually do it. If they do actually do it, if you look at it from a non-class analysis standpoint, it's just purely stupid because it'll completely crush the economy. It will depress living standards. It will cause unemployment. But it's possible they might do this. And I think it's really draconian and insidious to think that they would, but it's possible because, this labor, quote unquote, labor shortage and the sort of great resignation that's happened has given workers a little bit more leverage than they otherwise had before. And we see that with all these new strikes happening. Workers are starting to become aware that they have more leverage. This could be a way, raising interest rates to completely stomp that.
Yeah, I've wondered about that too. I mean, one thing with to put the Great Resignation in context, I am sure a lot of people are voluntarily leaving work, but even I was like, okay, what are they living off of? We haven't had expanded unemployment in a long time. You can't live off a $300 a month tax credit anywhere in the country, like, so maybe some of it's women who didn't return to work because there's still no childcare in the United States context, but this is larger than the U.S. A lot of it is, I mean, if you look at excess deaths, there's a lot more dead people than people are really acknowledging, which I know is morbid, but we really do have to there are a lot of people who died in the last, 2 years. I mean, in the
Mm-hmm.
U.S., we're over a million excess, and we're approaching a million diagnosed COVID. So it's like that should affect an economy. The 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 bigger the issue that I've wondered about, though, is we also know that the U.S. has been narrowing you know, its quote worker productivity or efficiency, or I would call it exploitation rate, for the past 2 decades, meaning that there wasn't a lot of excess capacity of labor anyway. So a small change in employability would actually make it seem like there was this massive labor shortage when it's actually they'd been cutting down to overexploit labor for a long, long time. And it's just become obvious under COVID. That's one theory, but that does empower workers. I mean, just from the whole, if you think about worker power as in the ability for people to scab on you, you don't have when you have very high employment levels, there's no one who's going to be incentivized to scab. I mean, as simple as that. That's a very simple way of explaining it, but it is a way of explaining it, which means labor has more ability to strike or to do other actions. I ironically, I do think that parts of the Great Resignation are a bad thing, in so much that they indicate that in the United States, at least, organized labor is still so weak that strikes still have to be informal, or they have to be at job site quitting in mass as effective strikes, because there is
I
no
actually think
formalization.
I
Mm-hmm.
think the Great Resignation and the strikes are kind of, they're related, but they're not,
Mhm.
in the sense that I think so the strikes are more from like the traditional working class people who are just paid less, lower wages, and want to bargain for higher wages now that they're more in demand and there's a shortage. There's a lesser reserve army of labor.
Mhm.
So there's, because of that, they have more bargaining power. With the Great Resignation, I think it's that, from what I've seen, it's actually this is, I don't have like the factual evidence to say where the demographics are when it comes to the Great Resignation, but just I paid a lot of attention to the anti-work subreddit, and it does seem
Mhm.
overwhelmingly that like the type of people quitting jobs are more so white collar, middle class professions, like people in office jobs who gained enough money to save already to live off of, but are kind of quitting the grind, so to speak.
So yeah, so they have somewhat significant reserve. I've been wondering about that too because I
The
was like,
BS job sector, like the
right,
bullshit
yeah,
job sector. Yeah.
yeah, the same the people David Graeber writes about,
Mhm.
administrative work and stuff. I mean, and a lot of those jobs have become untenable, but they also aren't super necessary. Or if they are necessary, they're necessary for legal constraints, not for actual productive constraints. Um, which is its own problems. Um,
Mhm.
so that leaves us where we're at. I um I was gonna ask you, you're in Canada, I'm in the States. Where do you think Canadian politics is going to go right now? I somewhat think that, not to sound conspiratorial, but this row with the convoy trucks has distracted people from the economic problems that are going to be coming up in Canada soon. Um, in a way that maybe, I mean, we're going to see it in the U.S. too. We're going to have our own truckers convoy in about a week.
Even
Um,
though you guys don't even have mandates.
no, and we don't have mandates. We
It's
we
never
don't have
about the mandates.
we don't have a
This
national policy like most democratic states even have dropped our I mean, they pretty much just gave up during Omicron anyway. So like you I will I mean they effectively decided to adopt the herd immunity strategy. Which
It's not even
uh
a strategy. It's more like just giving up, because
yeah,
we know
the
it. We know it like doesn't work. Like
right.
the immunity lasts as long as the vaccine does, so it's not
Yeah.
really a strategy.
Well, it is the herd immunity every year in perpetuity, I guess. But but I mean my point on that is just to say that Canada has fared a little better for doing parts of this. Your social safety net was far more generous early on than ours. I mean, it almost always is, but um, it does seem like that may be ending under the Trudeau government. What do you think that's going to mean for Canadian politics?
I don't know if our social safety net would end under like so much, because that's the difference really between the Conservative and Liberal Party, is that I would say the Liberal Party, for the first time under Trudeau, and this is the mainly only reason why I think Trudeau is like a lesser of evil to the Conservative Party, is that they have basically rejected austerity. The Liberal
Mm,
Party used to be the one balancing budgets. They completely rejected that. Uh, they haven't embraced MMT. Obviously, they still have like wonky ideas about interest rates, but they have basically stopped caring about the deficit, which I think is good. There's a lot of things going that went on with Canada and COVID. I think one big difference between Canada and the US was we got something called CERB, which was basically like a basic income of around
mm,
$2,000 a month. It was only given to people who lost their job or can't work because of COVID. It wasn't universal. So there's a lot of people. So no, it was only given to people who lost their job. So there's some people who couldn't work, like for example, my barber couldn't work, and he had to like work like illegally on because during lockdown, just to make
mm.
ends meet, because he wasn't able to, he wasn't eligible for the CERB. But yeah, obviously the payments, I think it was a good thing. Largely, it's better than the US, where you only got like a one-time $2,000 check, right?
Yeah, we got three, but they each one was one time, and we got we got expanded unemployment, which was fairly generous for our unemployment, but it was administered by the states, and certain states could screw it up. Certain states actually also, a lot of the Republican states rejected, like stopped taking the expansion early. Um, we have a much less centralized policy just in general. It's much harder
Well,
to
ours
generalize
too.
about.
Ours too is also a federalist system. So it's a system where the provinces are the ones setting the mandates.
Mm,
Also in Canada, except that in Canada now, there's about 3 provinces: Saskatchewan, Quebec, and Nova Scotia, who have removed mandates.
mm,
Ontario will be removing mandates in March.
mm,
It's completely because of the truckers. I mean, people, they'll try to say, "Oh, it's our strategy." It's because they're scared of the truckers. They're all conveniently conservative parties, governors. We don't have governors; we have premiers. But that's the thing. The federal government in Canada is liberal. A lot of the provincial governments are dominated by conservative parties who are pretty much completely capitulating to the trucker protests.
mm,
Uh, and this is another thing about. Well, first I'll get in with I'll finish with the point about CERB, the
mm,
payments. The payments gave workers a lot of leverage indirectly because a lot of people were able to quit their jobs. Actually, ironically, because of CERB, I was able to start my YouTube channel. I would not normally have probably been able to have the time to do that, but there was like a 4-month period where I was unemployed, so I was able to like start a lot of stuff. Um, but yeah, so I think this has given people leverage. It has led to sort of resignation, so to speak.
mm,
Um, and this is why I want to just get this point across. I don't like, there's this prediction: will UBI become a reality in capitalist countries? I don't think UBI, at least not in the way it's like a real universal basic income, will be implemented by neoliberal countries, because, as we've clearly seen, this is not good for the leverage of the capitalist class.
mm,
Uh, it's really the same reason why they don't like full employment. They don't like a job guarantee, because then you can quit your job and get a new one.
mm,
It just decreases the bargaining power. So, and there's this idea. I mean, there's some like leftists who think like UBI is there to like save capitalism. Who knows? Maybe, if demand is low enough. But I don't think they're very scared of it, because the experience with CERB, which was implemented out of desperation to revitalize consumer demand and prevent like complete catastrophe, uh, it has basically declined the leverage of the capitalist class. And what we have seen in politics in Canada is the Liberal Party is like the second most enthusiastic billionaires party, kind of like the Democrats. Uh,
mm,
Not as bad, but they're like that. They play the same role. Uh, and you've seen a sort of shift from the big business class, but even more, especially the small business class, towards the Conservative Party. A huge realignment, where the Conservative Party there's this big push to end mandates ever since 2020. So this
mm,
we're now manifesting itself as the Freedom Convoy that's about ending mandates. It's really the anti-mask movement, kind of rebranded, and I think it plays the same role that the Tea Party played in the opposition to Obamacare. And like, lack of a better term, it's basically astroturfed. The Freedom Trucker Convoy. 90% of truckers in Canada are vaccinated, uh, and the Canadian Truckers Alliance unions denounced the protests. You don't have any working demands, like working class demands, from the protests. It's not about raising the wages of truckers or adding some
mm.
benefits like sick days. Nothing. It's just all about the mandates and the masks. Basically, all the COVID mandates, including the isolation. Now it's been reduced to 5 days in Canada instead of
They're
14.
just like in the States, yeah.
Yeah, now they want to eliminate it all.
Mm,
And there's a big incentive in terms of this thing is, I noticed a lot of leftists, they tend to think of only like the capitalist class as like billionaires, but like the small businesses in times of crisis almost like always side to the right.
right.
And yeah, and the small business, they have, it's the same dynamic as we know as Marxists, right? Is that they have the same relationship between employers and employees, and the mandates make it harder for one employers to get enough consumers, especially in like restaurants, bars, concerts, all sort of industries, retail. they're getting a declining rate of profit because of these restrictions. And it's also harder for workers to discipline their workforce because there's a lot of people started working from home, those who were able to, especially in like advertising industries. They don't like that. And I mean, it's really clear why they don't like working from home. It's because it's actually proven to be more productive, but they don't like it because it gives them less control over the workforce, as well as they're with the isolation. Workers can take leave. They can take time off work. This is bad for productivity, exploitation rates. So really like the business owning class, they've been wanting these mandates gone for a long time. This was clear to me long before even just looking at it should be obvious now with the convoy. It's getting like millions of dollars in donations, over almost half of which is coming from the United States. And you have the Conservative Party of Canada overtly backing it and financially backing it. It's been clear since just by the numbers that this is not a working class protest, and it's serving the benefit of the capitalist class. At least, when we talk about the capitalist class, there's some areas of the capitalist class obviously who benefited from COVID, like the online delivery type of companies, this gig economy.
Rent seekers in general benefited in
Rent seekers.
COVID.
Yeah,
Right.
rent seekers as well. Yeah, I mean, if you include rent seekers, like Facebook's technically like a rent seeker,
Right,
in a way.
exactly.
Yeah, techno-feudalist and corporations, they've benefited, but like the majority, like traditional capitalists, really haven't. They've been pretty hurt by it. So there's this big backlash to the COVID mandates for a very long time. And although, like, even though it's obvious by the numbers that the convoy is like a project really to return back to normal, profit exploitation as usual, health, we don't care. This was obvious to me as far back as 2020 because the Conservative Party was already wanting to remove all mandates towards the end of 2020. And I remember just sometimes I go for like these really long walks, and sometimes I walk through these sort of like, there's like these neighborhoods that have the kind of bougie people, I wouldn't say like the super big bourgeoisie, but the upper middle class.
Right.
And all of them had conservative signs and signs about ending mandates, but I didn't see that in my neighborhood or a lot of the more like working class neighborhoods. I didn't see that, and that was obvious to me for day one that this whole anti-COVID, well, I mean anti-restriction, COVID restriction, was a right-wing project. And it's weird to see people on the left, like there's some people on the left today who are trying to claim this like freedom convoy is a working class thing. Richard Wolff recently said we should learn to seek common ground and turn this into a general strike. It's like, how? General strike against their own businesses?
Yeah, I mean, I pointed out to somebody, I was like, okay, one, historically speaking, truckers' strikes, I mean, in specific, the truckers' strike was used in Chile to try to undermine the Allende government. It was the first project of Cybersyn, was to figure out how to get past it. Secondly, I will say, yeah, there might be some workers involved.
Oh, I'm sure
this.
there are. Yeah,
Right.
There's some for sure, but it's like what I mean in terms of the interest, the financial interest backing
but
it.
Yeah, it's clearly what we call resource intensive or commodity producing capital, which has fairly low profit margins, and petit bourgeois people who, I will say this to almost sound Bakarin-esque on this, we probably should have thought a little bit more about in some of these rehabilitation programs that we did to keep them invested in the workers' protections. In the United States, however, we did that in the dumbest way possible, which was these loans that were easily gamed and abused largely by churches and stuff. It was kind of crazy. So, maybe I'm being a little bit too optimistic that there was ever anything that would have been done about that, because it's clear that what's happening to Canadian politics is actually it's resembling U.S. politics in its class coalitions, basically. Which it often does, but it seems to be more so under these restrictions. And it is very strange. It's not. Richard Wolff has been like this. there are all these, people who are worried about the expansion of the state, and I get being worried about the expansion of the state, but who've made it sound like these protections are universally opposed by workers, and I'm like, it it really depends on
Or that they
the
don't work. There's this
right.
idea that they don't work when it's at least in Canada. The vaccine mandates alone upped Canada's vaccination rate from 60% to 90%. I mean, it works. It gets a lot of the people who might not be like, they're not full, QAnon or skeptics, but people who are like, do I really want to get this? Like, if I don't have to, I won't. There's a lot of people like that, who are on the fence. And when you have the travel mandate, instantly you have the vaccination rate, so it works. But there is this effort to say, oh, and it doesn't work. You know,
Um, so it's been very strange to watch this time period where I've had a lot of people. In general, this has corresponded with the expansion of this notion of PMC, and somehow petty bourgeois truckers are somehow not are somehow not petty bourgeois just because they're blue collar, I guess. Like, there's been a lot of this confusion on the Marxist left, and part of it's because they
it's like
don't
it goes back to the Joe the Plumber thing.
right, exactly.
Remember with the Tea Party?
Right. It's just it's actually buying into right wing myths about what workers even are, and deliberately conflating wage earner interest with petty B interest. And I will admit, petty B, it's hard to be petit bourgeois these days. I'm not gonna disagree with that. But they're not the same thing as proletarians. And also pretending that people with degrees aren't inherently proletarians because they have degrees and not because of their wage relationship also seems weird to me as well. Because and so there's all this going on right now, and I'm like, well, there might be workers in certain industries in like Alberta who are really negatively affected by the lockdowns, but for the most part they're not. And if you look at what's going on in Ottawa, while a whole lot of people aren't super happy about the Trudeau's emergency response powers, no, almost nobody I know was supportive of the trucker rallies in Ottawa, including a whole lot of Marxist groups and Marxist groups, frankly, that don't normally get along. Like the Communist Party of Canada, the Communist Party of Canada (ML), and the IMT all took the same side on this, and
It's like
that's
the only thing they
weird.
united on.
Right?
Yeah.
It's just bizarre. So to hear all these people in the UK and America try to seize in on this as a way to do a general strike, or as a or even that it's the same as the Yellow Vest movement. I was like, the Yellow Vest movement was about technocrats raising the price of gasoline, which did affect like all workers. That's different from restrictions that pretty much only affect truckers. Like, um, and I've also had a lot of people point out to me, like which truckers are there and which ones aren't. Like, there's not, like, if you look at the trucker population of Canada, a lot of the more proletarianized truckers are
Southeast Asian.
Southeast Asian, particularly
Mhm.
Punjabi, and they're not involved at all.
Yeah,
So
I haven't seen. I've only seen probably a total of like 3 non-white people in all of like the protest footage. I mean, like, not to say that's an argument in itself, but it's very clear. There's a certain demographic of this protest. I mean, there is a certain middle class culture. Like, as stereotypical as it is, there's some truth to it. Like, there's a lot of people out there, right, who they're they just want to go back to going to Arby's and not wear a mask.
mm-hmm.
And they want to go to hockey games and not have to wear a mask. They want to whatever. Like, there's this idea of the thing is, because by and large this is the middle class dream, right? The middle class dream that's sold by capitalism, kind of make middle class people feel like they're separate or above proletarians, is that you live this consumer lifestyle and all that. And because COVID kind of, I mean, not really deprive them of that, but to a certain extent, there's this huge backlash, like first world problems, really. And I mean, to be honest, I hate third worldism. I'm not a Maoist at all. I hate Maoism. This is the first time, like, seeing the reaction to this with COVID has made me think I might read that Settlers book that everybody is always recommending.
I've read it. It's a mixed bag. But uh, having lived in the developing world for a good period, I was like, yeah, why can't why do we have so much more trouble with this? Um, it's it's been interesting. Particularly the vaccine and mask mandates, because I'm like, if you don't want lockdowns, I'm like, I don't really want lockdowns either. I think they're psychologically destructive. But like that's the epidemiologically safe way out. Why are you throwing a fit about that too? Like, and for people who think it's going to just stop with the COVID vaccine because of the Omicron variant or whatever, and that's what's prompting this. I've known people who I thought were smart, like, make really dumb arguments about vaccines, and I was like, you realize that this vaccine is still more effective than the flu vaccine. But I've also seen this expand out just general anti-vax sentiment, including stuff like, and I've also seen the resurgence of stuff like AIDS denial, which I hadn't seen in like 10, 15 years. So it's gonna be interesting, the downstream effects of this. Um, and it has been strange to me, um, how this has become a proxy for whether or not, like, one's um political orientation, regardless of what one calls themselves. Um, uh, so yeah, I'm a little worried about it. I am also like the trucker convoy in the U.S. I'm just like, what is it? Yeah, what is this even doing? Like it like there you don't even have as clear a policy objective as you do in Canada. Like most states don't even have anything right now that are
This,
restricting movement.
this is my critique of left populism. Okay, is left populism, will try to like capitalize and entail um, like certain popular sentiments, and they'll take them for their word.
Mm-hmm.
This is what Richard Wolff's been doing, and it says, "Oh, I get that some people, the anti-vax people, are crazy, but the anti-mandate people, I understand them. They're scared about government overreach." And it's like, it's not really all this what this is about. I mean, the vast majority of people I've seen who are anti-mandate were just people who were previously anti-mask. It's really, I haven't seen the people who, I mean, it depends on how the mandate's enforced, obviously. Like there's different ways. Like I think some people have different ideas as to what the mandate is. I think some people who think that you need like a mandate to get a citizenship, I mean, that would obviously be a very different conversation. That's not what's happening at
Right.
all.
Oh, or well, and the U.S. mandates, for example, the U.S. employer mandates, I knew were going to be a problem because they were so weirdly selective in who they did and did not apply to. They weren't universal.
Mm.
Um, and because of that, I was fairly sure that a conservative court would be able to overturn them on decent jurisprudence. Um, but that again, that's not about efficacy. That's just about the weirdness of U.S. law. Um,
Decentralization in general.
right.
This whole pandemic, to be honest, has made me a lot like, actually, this I'll admit,
Mm-hmm.
from 2020 to 2022, it like pushed me from leftcom to sort of centrist Leninist to
Mm-hmm.
a certain extent, just because just, and I also just seeing, like, really, for me, what worries me about COVID is just what this tells us about the climate catastrophe.
Yeah.
Because frankly, there's going to be a lot of drastic measures that are going to have to be put in place, which will require like fast action and agreement between provinces and states. But it's also just the public reaction to it. I mean, we haven't properly conditioned. The fact is that people will have to deal with sort of like, quote unquote, government power, government decisions. And I think the public has a very Orwellian idea of how power works, that it's all like top down, that it's the baddies in the government or the globalists who want to impose anything, and rather that power is much more multifaceted, often
Mm-hmm.
horizontal, and has conflicting interests. I think all of this sort of backward sentiments that I think are really rooted in popular media and education system as to like how power works. We're taught in America and Canada, we're the free societies, and in the East, like they're all collectivist, etc., centralist. So there's this idea of freedom that is very, very one-dimensional, and people will, on the right especially, will question vaccine policies and their encroachment on their freedom, but then they won't question the fact that they have to work 9 to 5 to exist, or to live in a
Mm,
house or pay for water. They won't question these like types of freedoms, and I think it's rooted in that. Really, I think it can boil down to soft power and hard power, because I think by and large, I mean, we obviously have hard power, like a insane military police apparatus, especially even more in the U.S. But most of society is governed, in my opinion, at least when it comes to. I have a video about this called the Burnout Society,
mm,
which goes into the theories of Byung-Chul Han and psychopolitics. Is a lot of like how people are ideologically conditioned and governed is through soft power.
mm,
And so a lot of the ways people are actually controlled by like the government, by capitalists, is in a very indirect way, in a way that gets people to control themselves. And because of that, um, people are often very oblivious to the real forms of control that exist. And when suddenly there's like this desperate attempt to, keep the system in place through like a hard power measure, like vaccine mandates, then there's suddenly, oh, we're in totalitarianism now, as if they weren't before, right?
right. I mean, yeah. It's wild to me how what people miss about the way governments actually work. And I mean, the idea that the United States. Yeah, I have my critiques of China and whatnot, but having lived in East Asia, the idea that the United States was actually more individualist, I used to laugh at, because I'm like, no, I mean, yes, people are more socially oriented, but so are we. We just lie to ourselves about it. It's like I mean, like, and you see this. I mean, you literally see this by the fact that I can predict someone's politics based on their age and region, as much
Yeah.
as anything else. Um, I the one thing I'll say where you see class politics show up in America is that working class people are just more likely to be completely depoliticized now. That was not true before the 1950s, but it is true now. Um, Variety of reasons for that, and I think they're kind of obvious when you think about it. But because even the one thing we can say about the Democrats is, while they had a chance to not choose austerity at the beginning of this crisis and made foregone or at least like gestures in that direction, we can see that even if it's only for two people in the Senate. But I kind of think that's a cop out. Um, that they have decided that they're going to go the austerity route, and there if there's going to be social policy that's progressive, it's going to be in states. And as I told someone the other day, I'm like, yeah, the California Democrats sold out and not doing single payer, but it also doesn't make sense for a state government that doesn't have currency sovereignty to try to do
Hmm.
single payer. Like, that never made that much sense. Like, California is going to get into it will get into funding binds that the feds would never get into. Um, and the feds will make sure they did. Like, so it's funny to be in this situation. Um, I'd like to thank you for coming on. I think this has been useful, so we can see the application. And if there's anything you'd like to plug before you go?
Yeah, absolutely. I would recommend checking out, for those who haven't seen my channel. It's one dime, number one dime, and you can watch my videos on company time. I'd recommend watching the tax the rich video, the deficit myth. The videos I'm most proud of are the Burnout Society and why billionaires prefer Democrats. I think
Mhm.
that's probably a very relevant one for sure. And maybe a concluding point, kind of to circle back what we originally started, is one way I think the biggest way in which Marxism and MMT are, I don't want to say compatible, but mutually useful, at least when fused, is that MMT really takes the emphasis away from abstract monetary values and what is the debt, what is the cost, to the real economy, which I think that's what Marxism was always about. It goes back to labor. It's not about the cost. It's about, the laborers who make things, and the real resources that create them. So I think, that's something that Marxists or MMT people who are skeptical of Marxism should think about. And really, as usual, look into, I would read literature on both ends. It's kind of what I'm trying to do with my videos, to kind of encourage people to kind of explore these things.
All right. I would tell, if I were to make a book suggestion, I would tell people to read Kelton, but also check out
Seven Deadly Frauds by Mosler, mainly because that's like a pamphlet. It's like,
yeah,
you can read it in an hour.
and I would also say take out the work Blood and Money by David McNally, which is for the Marxist approach that's similar as it, so that's what I would tell people to check out, and follow these debates. I think a whole lot of people who've had a whole lot of different assumptions are about to, I don't know, I am worried that the Democrats are about to go on an austerity binge, and I don't know that the liberals in Canada are going to do the same thing. But I'm worried that they're about to take the exact wrong lesson from the last couple of rounds of elections. But of course, they're the Democrats. It seems to be what they do. All right, and with that, we're out.
Night, 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 night,